Welcome back, everyone, to Wisdom of the Philosophers. Today we're taking on Plato's Apology, really a foundational text. It's believed to capture Socrates' defense at his trial. If you enjoy these explorations, do remember to like and subscribe. Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss out.
It's a fascinating piece, but right away you run into this challenge. How much is the historical Socrates? And how much is Plato crafting a character? We're working from the Benjamin Jowett translation, the Project Gutenberg ebook, and its introduction is quite helpful for setting the stage.
Exactly. So our goal today is to unpack the core of that defense as Plato gives it to us. We want to understand the arguments, sure, but also the historical backdrop and, why it still resonates. We'll look at the charges, his replies, what it tells us about Socrates himself.
And there are definitely some surprising aspects to consider.
Okay, so that first big question the Jowett introduction raises, history versus Plato's version. How much can we trust this as Socrates' actual words?
It's tricky. The intro points this out immediately, and it brings in other sources like Xenophon's Memorabilia. Xenophon seems to suggest Socrates could have, maybe, gotten off if he'd been a bit more agreeable.
More conciliatory, yeah. But the tone in the apology itself is pretty defiant, isn't it? It feels like a deliberate choice.
It does. And then there's Hermogenes, a friend of Socrates, whose testimony suggests Socrates wasn't actually that keen on living longer anyway. Plus, that divine sign he mentions. Apparently it stopped him from preparing a formal written defense.
He felt his whole life was the preparation, right?
That seems to be the idea Hermogenes conveys, which fits, interestingly, with how Cicero later describes Socrates in the Apology.
Oh, yeah, the introduction mentions that quote. Something about him seeming like a teacher, not a defendant.
Exactly. Ut non supplex aut reus sed magister aut dominus videritur esse judicum. Like a master or teacher to the judges, not a beggar or someone accused. It's a powerful image.
It really is. And the style itself, the introduction notes it's sort of rambling, loose, and desultory.
Right, possibly Plato imitating how Socrates actually talked in the Agora, very conversational, not like formal rhetoric. Even if it's Plato's construction, it adds to this feeling of maybe authenticity.
So Plato's crafting this image. The intro even compares it to Thucydides writing Pericles' speeches. Is it more about an ideal, then, than literal truth?
That's kind of the implication. Maybe think of it less like court reporting and more like a philosophical statement using the trial as a stage. Plato wants to show us something about wisdom, about the ideal philosopher, through Socrates.
And Plato mentions he was at the defense.
Yes, in the Apology itself. But then in the Phaedo, which describes Socrates' death, Plato notes he wasn't there. The introduction flags this difference, maybe suggesting different intentions for each work.
Interesting. And what about that story with the Oracle of Delphi, the one that supposedly started his whole mission?
The intro calls that anecdote suspicious. The argument is that Socrates was probably pretty well known before his friend Xenophon asked the oracle if anyone was wiser, so maybe Plato added that part or emphasized it to give Socrates' mission this kind of divine stamp of approval.
Framing it as a calling.
Precisely. So the introduction's overall take is nuanced. It suggests the apology is probably true to Socrates' character as Plato saw him, but Plato definitely shaped it. We might not have the exact words, but we likely get the spirit.
Okay, so let's look at the structure Plato gives this defense. The introduction breaks it down into 3 parts.
Yeah, it's fairly clear. You've got the main defense against the charges first. Then, after the verdict, there's his response where he argues about the penalty. And finally, those last words, which become quite reflective, even prophetic.
Let's get into that main defense. How does he start? The intro says he apologizes, but not really for his actions.
Right, it's about his style. He basically says, look, I'm not a fancy orator. I talk like I always talk, plain language. He contrasts himself immediately with the polished speakers you'd normally expect in court, sets him apart.
And then he separates his accusers into 2 groups.
Yes, a really smart move. There are the older, nameless ones, basically meaning public prejudice, rumors that have been around for ages, and then the later, specific guys, Melitus, Anytus, and Lycon. He presents them as just voicing those old resentments.
And the accusations themselves.
Yeah.
From both groups.
They kind of boil down to similar things. The old rumors paint him as, a busybody looking into science-y stuff, things under the earth and in the heavens, making weak arguments seem strong and teaching others to do it. Think Aristophanes play clouds, that sort of caricature.
And the formal charges from Melitus and the others.
Those are more specific. Corrupting the youth, and impiety, not believing in the city's gods, bringing in new divinities. Those were apparently the actual legal charges.
Okay, so how does he tackle these? He first clarifies he's not a certain type of thinker, right?
Exactly. He distinguishes himself. He says he's not a natural philosopher speculating about the cosmos, claims he knows nothing about it. And crucially, he insists he's not a sophist.
Because he doesn't charge fees?
That's the main point he makes here. Unlike famous sophists like Gorgias or Prodicus, he never took money. There's even a bit of irony when he mentions Avenus, who apparently did teach virtue for a fee 5 minae, which Socrates calls moderate. A little dig, maybe.
Right, so if he's not those things, why the bad reputation, the evil name? This brings us back to the Oracle story, doesn't it?
Yes, this is his explanation. His friend Xenophon goes to Delphi, asks the Oracle if anyone is wiser than Socrates. The Oracle says no one is wiser.
Which apparently confused Socrates himself.
Deeply, because he believed he knew nothing. So to figure out what the god meant, he started questioning people known for their wisdom, politicians, poets, craftsmen.
And what did he find?
Well, according to his account, they all came up short. Politicians sounded confident but lacked real understanding. Poets composed beautiful things, but often through inspiration, not, deep knowledge of what they were saying. Craftsmen were skilled in their specific trade, but then thought they were wise about everything else too.
So his conclusion was?
That the Oracle was right, but in a way he hadn't expected. True wisdom wasn't about having knowledge, but about recognizing your lack of it. He knew nothing, while these others thought they knew things, but didn't.
And this constant questioning, this mission, is what got him into trouble.
That's his claim. It revealed people's ignorance, often their conceit, and that made enemies. Plus, he says, young, wealthy guys found it entertaining to watch and started imitating him, annoying even more people.
So those professors of knowledge, as the intro calls them, hit back.
Yes, accusing him of corrupting these young followers and trotting out the usual charges against philosophers, atheism, twisting words, and so on.
Okay, so that sets the scene. Then comes the direct confrontation with Meletus.
Yeah, this is a famous bit. Socrates uses his questioning method right there in court. He tackles the corrupting the youth charge first. Asks Meletus, if I corrupt them, who improves them?
And Meletus says, everyone else.
All men, yeah. Which Socrates immediately shows is absurd. How likely is it that one person corrupts and everyone else improves? Think about horse training, he suggests usually. Only a few people know how to train them properly.
Good point. And then he argues it wouldn't make sense for him to intentionally harm people he lives near.
Right. Why would he want to make his neighbors bad? It would only harm him in the end. And if he did corrupt them, but unintentionally, well, then Meletus should have taken him aside and instructed him, not dragged him into court.
Pushing for dialogue over punishment again.
Exactly. Then they moved to the impiety charge. Not believing in the state gods, bringing in new ones. Socrates presses Meletus. Do you mean I believe in no gods, like I'm a complete atheist? Or just different gods?
And Meletus goes for broke, calls him an atheist.
He does. He even throws in that old line about Socrates saying the sun is stone and the moon is earth, confusing him with Anaxagoras, an earlier philosopher. Socrates brushes that off, basically saying everyone knows those ideas aren't his.
And then Socrates springs a logical trap. Something about demigods.
Yes. This is clever. Meletus' own indictment apparently mentions Socrates believing in divine beings, or spiritual agencies, which could include demigods. So Socrates says, well, wait a minute, if I believe in demigods, who are children of the gods, don't I have to believe in gods too?
You can't believe in mules without believing of horses or donkeys, sort of.
That's the analogy he uses later, yeah. It makes Meletus' charge look contradictory. Believing in divine activities or beings implies belief in divinity itself.
Okay, so after dealing with Meletus, Socrates explains his deeper motivations, right? His principles.
Yes, this is crucial. Why does he keep doing this, even when it's dangerous? He says he has to obey the god's command, just like he obeyed his commanders in battle at places like Potidaea and Delium. It's a duty.
And he makes that powerful point about death.
He does. He says he doesn't know if death is good or bad, but he knows that abandoning his post, his philosophical mission assigned by the god, is bad. So he'll choose the known good, obeying the god, over fearing an unknown, death.
A very clear hierarchy of values.
Yeah.
He won't stop his questioning.
No. He says he'll obey God rather than the Athenians. He'll keep urging people to care for virtue and their souls above money or reputation. He even tells the jury, if you're acquitting me on the condition I stop philosophizing, forget it.
Wow. So why didn't he get involved in politics more directly then? He mentions the divine voice again.
Yeah, his daimonion. He claims this inner sign held him back from public life. His reasoning. that his commitment to justice would have inevitably put him at odds with the powerful, and he'd have been killed quickly, preventing him from doing any real good through his philosophical work.
But he did stand up sometimes. The intro mentioned a couple of examples.
He brings them up himself. The time he opposed the illegal collective trial of the generals after the Battle of Arginusae, and when he refused to obey the 30 tyrants' order to arrest Leon of Salamis. He uses these to show he was willing to risk his life for justice, even in the public sphere, when principle demanded it.
So it wasn't cowardice, just a different path he felt called to.
That's his argument. And he comes back to his teaching, or rather his non-teaching. He insists he never charged fees. It was part of his mission. People listened voluntarily.
And he can't be blamed if some of them, like Alcibiades or Critias, later turned out badly.
He argues he can't be responsible. He never promised to teach them anything in the sophistic sense, just to examine ideas with them. And then he makes a strong point. Where are the people I supposedly corrupted? Or their fathers and brothers?
He points out his supporters are there in court. Like Plato.
Exactly. Crito, Critobulus, Plato, they're all there supporting him. If he was such a corrupting influence, surely their families would be complaining.
And finally, in this section, he refuses to beg or use emotional appeals.
Right. No weeping children, no pleading for mercy. He sees that as shameful for himself, for Athens, and disrespectful to the judge's oath to decide justly based on the law and evidence, not pity. He stands on his principles.
Okay, so inevitably the verdict comes. Part 2. The sentence. He's convicted.
As he probably expected, and Idas proposes the death penalty, and Socrates' response is, well, pure Socrates, full of irony.
He suggests he deserves free meals in the Prytaneum.
Yeah, like an Olympic victor. He argues his service to the city, getting people to examine their lives, is far more valuable than winning a chariot race. It's a sarcastic way of highlighting what Athens should value.
What about actual alternative penalties?
Yeah.
Prison? Exile?
He dismisses them. Prison is obviously bad. Exile. He says he'd just end up doing the same thing elsewhere and getting kicked out again. So he initially suggests a small fine, 1 mina. Then, prompted by his friends Plato, Crito are mentioned, who offered to back him, he increases it to 30 minae, a more substantial sum.
But he still maintains his stance. He doesn't regret his defense.
Not at all. He says dying now, at his age, will bring shame on Athens for killing a wise man. He'd rather die having spoken his way, true to himself, than live by compromising.
And he says something about a swifter penalty overtaking his accusers.
Yes, a powerful line. Death might be catching up to him, but he says the penalty of unrighteousness, a moral penalty, runs faster and has already caught them.
Which brings us to the third part. His final words after the death sentence is confirmed. He gets prophetic.
He does. He tells those who condemned him that his death won't silence criticism. In fact, he predicts younger, harsher critics will now arise, inspired by his example, to challenge the Athenians even more fiercely. Killing him won't solve their problem.
And then he speaks to those who voted to acquit him.
Yeah, he offers them some comfort. He notes that his divine sign, which often stopped him from doing things, was silent throughout the trial and sentencing. He interprets this to mean that what's happening, his death, must actually be a good thing.
How does he see death as potentially good?
He considers 2 possibilities. Either death is like a deep, dreamless sleep, a state of nothingness. And wouldn't that be a gain, he asks? Infinite time with no disturbance. Or it's a journey to another place.
Where he can meet heroes and other thinkers.
Exactly. He imagines conversing with figures like Homer, Odysseus, Sisyphus, and the just judges of the underworld. For him, the chance to continue his examinations there would be incredible happiness. Either way, sleep or journey, it's not something to fear.
So a remarkably calm, even optimistic view.
Absolutely. He concludes with that famous line, or the sentiment behind it, that no real evil can happen to a good man, either in life or in death. He believes the gods are watching over him, and this is somehow for the best. He even forgives his accusers and judges.
And his very last request about his sons.
Just that his friends should trouble his sons, keep questioning them if they start caring more about money than virtue, or if they think they're important when they're not. Basically, give them the same Socratic treatment he gave everyone else. Keep the mission going.
It's quite an ending. Now, the introduction we've been referencing also reflects on Plato's role in all this. Did Plato mean for Socrates to sound, well, a bit tricky or even annoying sometimes?
That's a really interesting question the intro raises. Some of those arguments, especially against Miletus, like the one corrupter versus all improvers, or the demigods implying gods, they can seem a bit like clever debating tricks, maybe sophistry.
So was Socrates just trying to win points? Or maybe deliberately provoke them?
The introduction suggests maybe not. Perhaps those arguments were tailored specifically to Miletus, who seems easily confused. Or maybe they contain that Socratic irony, a surface meaning, and a deeper one. It's hard to be sure.
What about his defense concerning his followers, like Alcibiades? The intro says it might seem weak.
It could seem unsatisfactory, yes. But the intro suggests the core point isn't denying association, but denying that his teaching method caused their later bad actions. It links back to his idea that he doesn't really teach in the traditional sense.
In the argument that if he corrupted them, it was involuntary.
That ties into a fundamental Socratic belief that nobody does wrong willingly. All evil comes from ignorance. If he corrupted them, it must have been because he didn't know better, which loops back to the idea that he should be instructed, not punished. It's consistent with his philosophy, even if it sounds odd legally.
Okay, and the demigod argument, again, it wasn't necessarily him saying he believed in the specific state gods.
The intro suggests he's working within the framework of Athenian beliefs to refute the charge of total atheism. He likely had his own, perhaps more philosophical understanding of the divine, including his inner sign, but he uses the common ground of myths about demigods to counter Miletus's specific accusation.
So the introduction's final take on Socrates' attitude, the irony, the seeming arrogance,
is that it probably wasn't an act. It stemmed from his deep conviction, his lifelong way of being. He wasn't trying to be insolent or rush towards death. He simply couldn't make a defense that betrayed who he was and what he believed. His principles wouldn't allow it.
and that prophecy about future critics.
The intro notes it's maybe debatable how literally it was fulfilled, but it captures the spirit of someone who believes their cause is just and will inspire others after they're gone. A martyr spirit, perhaps. But again, the reminder is, this is Plato's Socrates we're analyzing.
Well, this has been a fascinating look into Plato's Apology. Thank you for joining us on Wisdom of the Philosophers for this exploration. We really hope it's given you some valuable insights into Socrates' defense and that whole complex relationship between a historical event and how it gets interpreted philosophically.
Absolutely. And we really encourage you to read the Apology yourself if you haven't, or revisit it. Think about those enduring questions it raises about justice, truth, what it means to live an examined life. What was it in Socrates' arguments that really stood out to you?
We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of history's great thinkers. Clicking that notification bell helps you stay updated. And please share your reflections in the comments below. What resonated with you? What questions linger?
We look forward to reading them.